Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
It is really great to be back for this one.
Yeah, we're finally entering the last phase of our trilogy today. This is part 3 of our series on Napoleonic tactics.
The finale.
Right. And if you have been with us for the last 2 deep dives into the sources, you know we've already completely dissected the disciplined linear world of the infantry.
We did. And we broke down the shock and awe of the cavalry right after that.
Exactly. We covered the line and the saber, but today we're talking about what they call the third arm, the loud one.
The loud one, yeah. The one that Napoleon himself.
A man who started his career as an artillery officer, I should add.
Right, a trained gunner. He called artillery the god of war.
And diving into the material, that title isn't just, rhetorical flourish.
Not at all. Napoleon's fundamental understanding of artillery didn't just help him win specific battles. It actually, it fundamentally restructured how wars were fought across the entire European continent.
Because we are moving from an era where cannons were sort of these helpful accessories on the battlefield to an era where they became the primary instrument of decision.
Yes. But before we light the fuse on this, so to speak, we do need to draw some boundaries for this deep dive.
Right, because artillery is a massive umbrella term. We aren't covering absolutely everything that explodes today, are we?
No, we really have to be specific to make this useful for you. We are focusing exclusively on field artillery.
So no sieges today.
No sieges, no static fortress guns. We are skipping those massive mortars that were just designed to lob giant shells over stone castle walls.
Because those are essentially static engineering challenges, aren't they?
Exactly. Today is purely about the mobile guns, the cannons and howitzers that actually moved with the armies, deployed in the mud of the active battlefield, and had to actively maneuver in real time against moving infantry and cavalry.
The sources refer to this period specifically as the Age of Artillery Battle. And that line has really stuck with me because it implies a major transition.
A shift from artillery as mere support to artillery as the main event.
Yeah, like in the 18th century under Frederick the Great, artillery was mostly there to annoy the enemy, right? Maybe break up a formation here or there.
It was an auxiliary force, but under Napoleon, artillery becomes a truly offensive weapon. It was used intentionally to punch a physical hole in the enemy line that the other arms, the infantry and cavalry, could then exploit.
It becomes the key to the lock.
It really does.
And to understand how that key turns, I think we have to look at the hardware first. I feel like the popular imagination, probably fueled by movies, sees cannons as these somewhat elegant tubes that just sort of effortlessly roll into place on the grass.
Oh, the reality is so different. When you look at the logistics, the sheer weight, the physics of it all, it is anything but elegant. It is incredibly heavy, brutal industrial work.
Powered almost entirely by muscle. Let's ground this in reality for a second. The source material highlights the Austrian 6-pounder Wurst system as a really prime example of light horse artillery.
Right. And the name itself, Wurst, really captures the aesthetic. It literally translates to sausage, referring to this sausage-shaped padded seat on the carriage where the gunners would actually sit while it was moving.
And this was designed specifically for speed, because it's horse artillery, meant to keep up with galloping cavalry forces. So the natural assumption is that this equipment must be light.
Well, light is a very relative term here. Let's break down the actual physical mass of this machine according to the texts.
Let's do it.
If you strip the whole thing down, just the gun tube itself, the actual cast bronze or iron barrel, weighs roughly 386 kilograms.
Which is about 850 pounds of dead metal.
Just for the tube. But a tube is completely useless without a carriage to mount it on. And the carriage has to be incredibly robust to withstand the massive recoil of a black powder explosion.
Right, it can't just be a flimsy wooden cart.
Exactly. So the wooden carriage, with all its heavy iron fittings in its wheels, weighs in at 435 kilograms. It's actually heavier than the gun it carries.
So we are already nearing a metric ton, and we haven't even added the crew or the ammunition yet.
Not yet. Then you add that worst seat we mentioned, which is another 69 kilograms.
Yeah.
And then you have to add the limber.
Which is crucial for people to visualize. A cannon by itself is essentially a two-wheeled trailer.
Right, and you really can't tow a perfectly balanced two-wheeled load over rough terrain efficiently. It digs into the mud.
So the limber fixes that.
Yes, the limber is a completely separate two-wheeled axle system that hooks onto the front of the cannon trail. It converts the whole two-wheeled setup into a functional four-wheeled wagon.
But the limber isn't exactly lightweight either.
No, it adds another 183 kilograms to the setup. Then you add the ammunition ready box, that's another 60 kilograms. And finally, you have the human element.
The crew riding along?
In the worst system, 4 gunners rode directly on the carriage itself so they could be ready to jump off and fire the moment the horses stopped. That's roughly 364 kilograms of personnel.
So when you do the math on all of that,
You were looking at a total combined weight of 1,497 kilograms, almost 1.5 metric tons.
for a single light field gun.
Correct. And if we were talking about a 12-pounder, which were the heavy position guns that Napoleon loved, the weight jumps significantly higher. Plus, remember, this whole contraption is about 5 meters long.
So you are basically dragging a vehicle the weight and length of a modern mid-sized sedan
With no engine.
with no engine through plowed, muddy fields.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual engine of the 19th century military, the horse.
I feel like we often glaze over the horse aspect of military history. We just see them as these sort of organic motorcycles that eat grass.
That's a great way to put it, but it's completely wrong. The biomechanics of the horse literally dictated the speed and scale of the entire war.
The horse is the hard limit on what a general can actually do.
Absolutely. And the math of horsepower in the sources is entirely unforgiving. Theoretically, if you are on a hard, well-paved road, a single healthy draft horse can pull about 3,360 kilograms at a walking pace.
So on a modern asphalt street, one really strong horse could almost pull that entire 6-pounder worst gun by itself.
Almost. But the Napoleonic Wars weren't fought on pavement. They were fought in the dirt.
Right.
Once you move to what the sources call unmetalled ground, basically dirt roads, that pulling capacity drops drastically to 860 kilograms per horse.
That is a massive drop in efficiency just from leaving a paved surface.
And it gets much worse. The moment you hit rough ground, meaning mud, hills, or off-road maneuvering across a battlefield, the capacity drops to just 500 kilograms per horse.
So just to barely move the gun through a field, you need a minimum of 3 horses pulling perfectly in sync.
At a bare minimum. And that calculation doesn't even account for the rider. If the soldier's actually riding the draft horse to guide it, which they did, the pulling capacity is halved again.
Wow.
So the realistic, sustainable target load for a campaign horse, if you didn't want it to literally die of exhaustion within a week, was only about 320 kilograms.
Meaning to move a 1,500-kilogram artillery system, you need a substantial team.
You need a whole train. Let's look at the logistical breakdown of a single British Royal Horse Artillery troop in 1813 that the sources provide.
Okay.
This is a unit with just 6 pieces of artillery, 5 6-pounder guns, and 1 howitzer.
Just 6 guns. How many animals did they need to field that?
185.
That ratio is just staggering to me. That's over 30 animals per gun.
Roughly, yes. You need 108 specialized draft horses just to pull the guns and the heavy ammunition caissons. Then you need 71 riding horses for the officers, the NCOs, and the gunners who aren't riding directly on the limbers.
And the rest.
You need 6-pack mules just for the unit's baggage.
It's not a military unit, it's a mobile farm, a herd.
And that herd consumes an unbelievable amount of resources. The logistical tail required just to feed and water 185 horses every single day is enormous.
Which explains the horrific attrition rates mentioned in the texts. There is a quote from the source material that really hammered this point home for me. It says, "If Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, Russia is the graveyard of military horses."
That is referring specifically to Napoleon's disastrous 1812 campaign into Russia.
The horses just died in droves.
They did. They died of pure exhaustion, starvation, and the freezing cold, long before most of them ever saw combat. And the strategic reality is, when the horses die, the artillery stops moving.
And if the artillery stops, Napoleon loses his primary ability to concentrate force.
Exactly. The loss of horse flesh in Russia was a strategic catastrophe on par with losing the soldiers themselves.
Speaking of the human element, the sources mention the crew sizes. We said earlier it took 4 men to ride the worst carriage, but the texts say a standard crew was actually assigned somewhere between 8 to 20 men per gun. Why the massive redundancy?
Well, because operating a field gun is incredibly physical labor, and obviously the battlefield is highly lethal. Technically speaking, yes, only 4 men are strictly needed to serve the gun.
1 to sponge, 1 to load, 1 to prime, 1 to fire.
Right, but you need several more men just to physically muscle that 1.5-ton gun back into position after the violent recoil of every single shot.
Because it jumps back several feet every time it fires.
Exactly. Plus, you need men in the rear to hold the horses and keep them calm. And most importantly, you need instant replacements.
Because of casualties.
Right. If an enemy canister shot flies over and takes out 2 of your primary crew members, that gun simply cannot afford to stop firing. You need fresh men standing right there to immediately step in and take the sponge or the rammer.
Okay, let's pivot from the heavy lifting to the projectiles themselves. We have these massive bronze and iron machines dragged into position by dying horses, crewed by these large, redundant teams. What are they actually throwing downrange at the enemy?
The sources categorize the main weapons into three distinct types: guns, howitzers, and mortars.
And since we established we aren't doing siege warfare today, we can largely set mortars aside.
Yes, mortars are strictly high-angle, indirect fire weapons. They shoot almost straight up to drop explosives behind walls. In an open field battle, we are really dealing with guns, which we colloquially call cannons, and howitzers.
What is the actual functional difference between a gun and a howitzer?
A gun has a relatively long barrel, a high muzzle velocity, and it fires its projectile on a very flat, straight trajectory. It is purely a direct fire weapon. You point it at what you want to kill.
And the howitzer?
Howitzer has a much shorter barrel and a lower muzzle velocity. It's designed to fire at a higher upward angle, usually between 20 to 40 degrees.
So it lobs the shot.
Exactly. It lobs explosive shells over physical obstacles, or it drops them down into hollows and ravines, where enemy troops might be hiding from direct cannon fire.
The primary everyday ammunition for the standard cannon was the round shot, right?
The solid cast iron ball.
Yes. Reading about it, it seems almost primitive compared to modern weaponry. There are no explosives inside it, no guidance systems. It's just a kinetic rock flying through the air.
It is purely a raw transfer of kinetic energy. But to truly understand why it was so terrifying, we have to understand the targets it was being fired at. The sources draw a very critical distinction between firing a round shot at a line formation versus firing it at a column formation.
Can you explain the difference in effect?
Sure, if enemy infantry is deployed in a standard line, which means they are standing shoulder to shoulder, maybe 2 or 3 ranks deep, it's spread very wide across the field, a solid round shot is actually somewhat inefficient.
Because it just punches straight through.
Right, it punches right through the thin line. It maybe kills 1 or 2 unlucky men in its exact path, and then just keeps going into empty space behind them. The tiny gap it leaves in the line is filled almost instantly by the men stepping closer together.
But against a column.
Against a column where the men are packed together very deeply, file behind file, marching in a dense block, the round shot becomes a lawnmower.
It just plows straight through the ranks from front to back.
It doesn't stop at the first man it hits. It tears completely through the second man, the third man, the 10th man. A single iron ball fired into a dense column can kill or horribly maim 15 to 20 men in a fraction of a second, if the angle is just right.
And this brings us perfectly to the concept of ricochet fire, which was honestly the technical detail that surprised me the most in these sources.
It's a grim science.
I always just naturally assumed you aimed your cannon directly at the target you wanted to hit. But the texts point out that often these expert artillerymen were intentionally aiming at the dirt in front of the target.
Under the right weather and terrain conditions, absolutely. If the ground on the battlefield is hard and relatively dry, you deliberately aim short. You want your iron ball to strike the earth roughly 50 to 100 yards in front of the advancing enemy formation.
Why? To get the bounce.
Exactly. Because if you try to fire a high plunging arc to hit them directly on the fly, and you miscalculate the range by just a few feet, the heavy ball just buries itself harmlessly deep into the mud behind them. The energy is totally wasted.
But if you skip it...
If you skip it off the hard ground, exactly like skipping a flat stone across a calm pond, the ball continues traveling perfectly parallel to the earth.
The sources call this staying at man-killing height.
Which is such a brutally clinical term. But it's accurate. You want that solid projectile to occupy the vertical space between a soldier's ankle and his head for the absolute maximum possible distance.
By bouncing the shot rather than flying it, you effectively double the lethal danger zone of every single cannon.
You do. And the visual reality of this technique is highly deceptive. A rolling cannonball bounding through the grass might look exactly like a harmless bowling ball just slowing down at the end of a lane.
But it isn't harmless.
Far from it. It still carries the sheer mass of a sledgehammer, and it's moving at incredible speed. There are accounts of inexperienced soldiers actually trying to stop a rolling round shot with their foot.
And it would just shatter them.
It would effortlessly tear the leg clean off. You simply could not interact with it.
So that is the physics of the solid shot. Then the sources move on to the common shell. This was primarily the domain of the howitzer, correct?
Yes, a common shell is essentially a hollow cast iron sphere. It's filled with loose black gunpowder and fitted with a rudimentary fuse.
A giant flying grenade.
That's a perfect analogy. The tactical idea is that you lob it so it explodes either directly over the heads of the enemy or right amongst their feet, sending jagged iron casing fragments flying violently in all directions.
The psychological impact of the shell seems like it was often vastly greater than its actual physical damage.
Without a doubt. A solid round shot is basically instant. You don't really see it coming. But a shell lands near you, the fuse is visibly hissing and smoking, and you have that agonizing moment of anticipation before the blast. It forces formations to scatter in panic.
But the sources also highlight that reliability was a massive, massive issue with these shells.
It was a constant problem. The fuses in this era were essentially made of small wooden tubes packed with a slow-burning chemical composition. They were incredibly inconsistent.
So sometimes they burned way too fast.
Right, they burn too fast, and the shell violently explodes high up in the air, doing absolutely nothing but making a loud noise and a cloud of white smoke.
And sometimes they burn too slow.
And then the shell thuds into the mud and just sits there sizzling. Sometimes it would eventually go off, but often it just allowed a brave or desperate enemy soldier to literally run up and extinguish the fuse with dirt or water.
Unbelievable. So we have round shot for long reach and dense penetration, and shells for area effect and pure psychological terror. Now, let's talk about the close-range, absolute nightmare weapons, canister and grape shot.
The giant shotgun effect.
Those two terms get used somewhat interchangeably in popular history, but the texts outline a very specific structural difference between them.
Yes, there is a clear difference. Grape shot is basically a cluster of relatively large iron balls arranged carefully around a central wooden spindle, and the whole thing is tightly wrapped in heavy canvas and tied with cord.
So it physically looks like a heavy bunch of grapes.
Exactly. It was generally used for slightly longer ranges than canister or against slightly heavier, harder targets.
And canister.
Canister is literally just a fragile tin or thin wooden cylinder entirely filled with much smaller iron balls, usually the size of musket balls or slightly larger.
And what exactly happens when you fire a canister round out of a cannon?
The fragile tin case is instantly shredded by the blast the moment it leaves the muzzle of the gun. The intense centrifugal force and the forward blast pressure violently spray all those dozens of small lead and iron balls out in a rapidly widening cone.
Like a massive fowling piece. What was the effective range on something like that?
Very short. It might be somewhat effective up to maybe 400 meters if you're lucky, but it is absolutely devastating at 200 meters or less.
And the physical effect on an advancing infantry formation.
It just wipes it out. It doesn't penetrate deeply through 20 men like a solid round shot does, but it completely covers a very wide front. A single well-timed canister volley from a battery can instantly strip the entire front rank off an advancing battalion.
The sources also mention a desperate, almost improvised variation called scattershot.
Ah, yes. That is truly the improvisation of the doomed. If a battery completely runs out of manufactured canister rounds, but the enemy is still charging right at them, the gunners would frantically fill a bag with literally whatever hard objects they had lying around.
Nails, scrap iron.
Broken glass, jagged stones from the dirt. Firing it destroys the internal rifling or the smooth bore of the bronze gun barrel eventually, but if you were down to using scattershot, you don't care about the gun anymore. You are just fighting for your own life at that point.
It's pure survival. Now, there is one major innovation mentioned here that attempts to bridge the gap between these weapons. The British invention. Spherical case shot, or as we know it much better today, shrapnel. Named after its inventor, Major Henry Shrapnel. He basically sat down and solved a major geometrical problem of artillery.
Which was?
Well, canister is incredibly deadly, but its range is terribly short. Round shot has great long range, but its path of destruction is very narrow. Shrapnel asked the question, how can I effectively deliver a wide spread of deadly canister balls to an enemy that is 800 yards away?
So he essentially put the canister inside a common shell.
That's exactly it. He designed a hollow iron shell that was filled with small musket balls, but it also contained a small internal bursting charge of gunpowder.
So you fire it out of the cannon exactly like a solid round shot.
Right. It flies efficiently through the air for 800 or 900 yards. And if the fuse is cut perfectly, it burns down just as it arrives, and the shell bursts open in midair directly above the enemy troops,
Releasing all those internal bullets at high velocity.
raining lethal lead down on their heads from above. It effectively extends that horrific shotgun effect all the way out to maximum cannon range.
That seems like an incredibly modern concept for the early 1800s.
The conceptual design absolutely was,
Right.
but the practical execution in the field still struggled immensely with those same completely unreliable wooden fuses we mentioned earlier.
Right. If the shrapnel shell bursts too early, it's just a deadly firework display in the sky.
And if it bursts too late, it just buries itself in the dirt before popping open harmlessly.
Yeah.
But when the highly trained British artillery actually got the range dialed in and the fuse length cut exactly right, it was utterly devastating to heavy French infantry columns who wrongly thought they were standing safely out of canister range.
Okay, so moving from the actual projectiles to their placement on the field, where does a general actually put these massive guns? My intuition, and I think probably most people's basic intuition, is that you always want to take the highest ground available. If I have a tall hill, I naturally want to put my cannon right on top of it.
And in the specific era of Napoleonic warfare, following that exact intuition could easily lose you the entire battle.
Really? Why is that?
It all comes down to what artillerymen call the slope problem.
Yeah.
These heavy field guns had very limited mechanical depression, meaning you physically couldn't tilt the front of the heavy bronze barrel down very far toward the ground.
Okay, so if you are up high...
You place your gun battery on top of a very high, steep hill. There is a massive zone of dead ground right at the immediate base of that hill where your guns simply cannot aim low enough to hit.
Because the barrel won't point down that steeply.
Exactly. The enemy infantry can literally march right up to the base of your hill, completely safe from your fire, and assemble before charging up at you.
And you also completely lose the ability to use ricochet fire from up there.
That is the other massive factor. If you fire steeply downward from a high hill, the iron ball hits the soft earth at a very sharp angle and immediately buries itself deep in the dirt. You get zero bounce, no rolling through the enemy ranks.
So if a high, steep hill is terrible, what is the ideal position for a battery?
You generally want what they called a low eminence, a very gentle, slight rise in the terrain that gives your commanders a clear visual field of the enemy, but has a smooth, long, perfectly flat slope spreading out in front of it.
You want a bowling alley, basically, not a steep cliff.
A bowling alley is the perfect way to visualize it. That gentle terrain absolutely maximizes your flat grazing fire and allows that incredibly deadly ricochet effect to function at maximum efficiency.
Speaking of clear visual fields, we also have to talk about visibility during these battles, or, more accurately, the complete lack thereof. We often use the phrase fog of war today as a metaphor for general command confusion, but on a 19th century black powder battlefield, it was very literal physical reality.
Oh, absolutely. Black powder doesn't just make a loud bang. It produces incredibly thick, heavy, white, highly sulfurous smoke, and it produces it in massive volumes.
So when a battery fires...
When a standard battery of 6 guns fires a synchronized volley, their entire immediate front is completely obscured by a blinding white cloud within seconds.
So they are effectively firing completely blind after the first few shots.
Frequently, yes. The primary sources constantly describe frustrated gunners firing blindly into a distant choking haze. They just have to aim roughly where they last saw the enemy massing, or they try to aim at the brief orange flashes of the enemy guns firing back through the smoke.
And they can't even see where their own shots are landing to correct their aim.
Exactly. It severely limited their effectiveness as the battle wore on.
But there is a really clever tactical note in the sources about actually weaponizing this smoke limitation.
Yes, the more aggressive, highly trained French commanders would intentionally use their own black powder smoke as a tactical screen.
How did that work?
They would order half of their battery to fire rapidly just to intentionally create a massive, thick smoke cloud. Then, completely under the visual cover of that artificial cloud, they would quickly limber up the other half of the guns and frantically rush them forward to a much closer, deadlier position without the enemy ever seeing the movement.
That's just brilliant improvisation, using the main limitation of your own weapon as a tactical asset to surprise the enemy.
It's the hallmark of a veteran artillery corps.
Let's shift our focus to the organizational level for a moment. How were these massive individual guns actually grouped together for combat? Because we clearly don't just see single cannons wandering around the battlefield on their own.
No, absolutely not. The fundamental tactical unit for artillery in this era is the battery, which was sometimes officially called a company, depending on the army.
What is the standard composition of a battery?
For a standard French battery, you are typically looking at 6 guns, meaning cannons, and 2 howitzers.
So 8 artillery pieces total in a unit.
8 pieces total. and that single battery would be fully manned and supported by roughly 100 to 150 men.
And the sources heavily distinguish between foot artillery and horse artillery. We briefly touched on this earlier with the Worst system, but what is the actual tactical role difference between the two on a grand scale?
Foot artillery is your heavy hitter. The gunners physically march on foot alongside the heavy guns. Because of that, they can only move at the walking pace of the infantry lines.
So they are primarily there to anchor the main defensive line or slowly smash the enemy center.
Correct. Horse artillery, on the other hand, is the elite, highly mobile strike force. Every single man in the unit is either mounted on his own horse or riding directly on the gun vehicles. They're specifically designed to move at the rapid pace of the cavalry.
Why does the cavalry actually need its own dedicated artillery support following it around?
Because inherently, cavalry has virtually no range firepower of its own. A heavy dragoon has a sword and maybe a short, inaccurate carbine, but he simply cannot knock down a fortified stone wall, and more importantly, he cannot break a dense, disciplined infantry square with just a sword.
He needs a cannon to physically blast the tight formation open so his horse can charge into the gap.
Exactly. It is pure combined arms doctrine. The horse artillery gallops up rapidly, unlimbers right in front of the enemy, blasts the tight infantry square with heavy canister at point-blank range, and the exact moment the square physically wavers from the impact, the cavalry charges in to finish them.
There is a really desperate defensive tactic mentioned in the text that I found fascinating: spiking the guns. We use that phrase metaphorically all the time today to mean ruining someone's plans, but back then it was a very literal, desperate physical act.
It was the absolute last resort of a doomed artillery crew. If your battery is completely isolated and about to be overrun, say by a massive enemy cavalry charge, and you know you cannot possibly hook up the horses in time to save the heavy guns, you have to ensure the enemy cannot simply turn your own cannons around and fire them at your retreating men.
So how do you actually spike a gun in the heat of battle?
Every dedicated gunner carried a specific type of specialized nail in his kit. It was a soft iron spike that intentionally had no head on it.
Okay.
In the final seconds before abandoning the cannon, you take a heavy hammer and you violently drive that headless spike straight down into the touch hole or the vent at the back of the cannon.
The small hole where the ignition fuse goes in to reach the main powder charge.
Right, you drive the spike in completely flush with the exterior metal so the enemy can't possibly grab it and pull it out with pliers. The soft iron physically deforms inside the narrow vent and completely seals the ignition hole shut.
So the gun is essentially bricked.
It instantly becomes a highly polished 1.5-ton useless paperweight. The enemy can physically capture the bronze barrel, but they absolutely cannot fire it. To fix a properly spiked gun, you have to painstakingly drag it all the way back to a rear workshop and slowly drill the iron spike out of the vent, which takes hours or even days.
So on the actual battlefield, the weapon is entirely neutralized.
Effectively destroyed for the duration of the fight, yes.
Let's talk about the man at the very top of all this, Napoleon himself. We established early on that he was fundamentally an artilleryman by training. How did he actually change the grand doctrine of how these batteries were used? What did he do that the traditional Austrians and Prussians simply weren't doing?
The single key innovation that Napoleon perfected is the absolute concentration of force.
Massing the guns together.
Yes. Napoleon famously wrote down his doctrine, saying, "Artillery, like other arms, must be collected in mass if one wishes to attain a decisive result."
Meaning before him, what did they do?
Before Napoleon, traditional commanders almost always spread their available guns out very evenly along their entire defensive line. They'd put 2 guns here to support this regiment, 4 over there for that brigade. It was very democratic. Everyone got a little bit of fire support.
But spreading them out means it lacked a concentrated punch.
It was an inherently defensive mindset. Napoleon completely inverted that. He would ruthlessly strip individual guns away from the frontline divisions and gather them to form what he called a grand battery. He would mass 50, 60, sometimes over 100 heavy guns in a single narrow sector of the battlefield.
And what is the physical effect of 100 heavy guns continuously firing at a single specific point in an enemy line?
Pure annihilation. Napoleon wouldn't waste time trying to slowly kill the entire enemy army evenly. He would carefully examine the field, pick the weakest hinge or the exact center point of the enemy line, and he would relentlessly hammer that one specific spot until whatever troops were standing there physically ceased to exist.
It's basically a massive, fiery battering ram strategy.
It is exactly a battering ram. The early coalition allies, like the British and the Russians, still tended to use their artillery defensively, primarily to protect their own infantry from attacks. Napoleon used his artillery strictly to attack.
He pushed the heavy guns aggressively forward.
Yes, closing the physical range as much as possible to ensure maximum destruction before his infantry ever even marched forward.
This aggressively offensive posture brings up a really interesting question discussed in the sources about counter-battery fire. If the enemy commander has 100 cannons aggressively shooting at your infantry lines, surely your own artillery should start shooting back at those enemy cannons to stop them, right?
Basic survival instinct definitely says yes. But the strict professional doctrine of the era, especially heavily enforced for the French and the British artillerymen, was absolutely no.
Why? That seems counterintuitive.
It all comes back to that grim, cold calculus of battlefield math we mentioned. A field cannon is physically a very small target. From the front, it's basically just two thin wooden wheels and a narrow bronze tube. It is incredibly difficult to actually hit a target that small with a smoothbore cannon from 1,000 yards away through thick smoke. Enemy infantry, however, standing packed in dense call formations, is a massive, soft target.
So it's seen as a complete waste of precious ammunition to duel with the other guns.
The standard rule of thumb drilled into commanders was, you only engage enemy artillery pieces if they are currently hurting your own infantry significantly more than you are currently hurting theirs. Otherwise, completely ignore the loud enemy cannons and focus 100% of your fire on killing the enemy foot soldiers.
It is incredibly cold, rational math. Let's look closely at the sheer consumption numbers the sources provide to really illustrate the massive scale of this industrial destruction. The specific battles of Wagram and Borodino are highlighted.
The numbers from those engagements are honestly staggering. At the Battle of Wagram in 1809, the records show the French army fired roughly 96,000 artillery rounds.
In a single battle?
Yes. That is nearly 100,000 heavy iron balls and explosive shells fired in just a few days of fighting.
And what about Borodino during the Russian campaign?
At Borodino, the French forces fired approximately 91,000 shots from their 587 available guns. If you divide that up, it averages out to about 155 shots fired per individual gun.
But the sources caution that averages are deceptive here.
Very deceptive. Because the guns stationed in the quiet, unengaged sectors of the battlefield might have fired almost nothing all day, which means the specific guns placed in the center Grand Battery were firing continuously until the bronze barrels physically expanded from the intense heat, and they literally couldn't force the ramrod down to load them anymore.
And when you step back and think about the logistics, every single one of those 91,000 heavy iron shots had to be physically carted in a wooden wagon all the way from factories in France or Germany deep into the heart of Russia by a struggling horse.
It really underscores the absolute logistical miracle that somehow kept these massive armies functioning at all. The sheer, crushing tonnage of raw iron being moved across a continent and then violently expended in an afternoon is very hard to truly wrap your head around.
Let's bring all these different tactical elements together now to look at the big picture. Combined arms. We've spent time looking at the infantry, cavalry, and artillery pieces separately across this series, but they only succeed when they function tightly together as a system. The sources clearly describe this intricate relationship as a deadly game of rock, paper, scissors.
It truly is the fundamental underlying dynamic of all Napoleonic tactics. Let's walk through the brutal cycle of how it plays out on the field.
Okay.
Scenario A. You order your cavalry to charge the enemy line. The enemy infantry clearly sees these thousands of heavy horses thundering toward them. If the infantry makes the mistake of staying in their thin, wide line, the cavalry will easily sweep around their flanks and roll them up, slaughtering them.
So the infantry responds to survive. They play paper, in this analogy. They immediately form a square.
Right. They form a dense, hollow box with a bristling hedge of sharp bayonets facing outward in all four directions. War horses are very smart animals. They will absolutely not charge blindly into a solid wall of sharp steel points, so the cavalry threat is effectively neutralized.
But now the infantry is totally bunched up. They've saved themselves from the horses, but they are now a massive, dense, static target.
And enter the artillery. Artillery plays scissors. A densely packed infantry square is the absolute dream target for a waiting gunner. You literally cannot miss it. A single solid round shot plows right through 20 men packed tight. A close-range canister volley easily wipes out an entire corner of the square.
So the infantry is being slaughtered by the guns, and they realize they have to rapidly break the square formation and spread back out into a line to minimize the artillery damage.
But the exact moment they break that tight formation to spread out, the hovering cavalry immediately charges right back in and cuts them down while they are disorganized.
It's an impossible trap.
It is a horrific dilemma. Napoleon's true tactical genius was consistently forcing the enemy commander to choose exactly how he wanted his men to die. Do you want to be sabred to pieces by the cavalry or blown to pieces by the artillery? You simply cannot defend your men against both threats simultaneously if the French coordinate them well.
But the artillery has a fatal vulnerability in this cycle too, right?
Yes, the circle completes itself. Cavalry beats artillery. If the fast-moving enemy cavalry can manage to flank the heavy guns or catch the slow batteries while they are painfully limbering up their horses to move, the unarmored gunners are completely dead men.
Because they can't form a square to protect themselves.
They have absolutely no defensive square. They have no personal weapons to speak of. They are just laborers completely exposed to the swords.
So to recap the cycle, cavalry beats the line, the square beats the cavalry, artillery beats the square, and cavalry beats the artillery.
That is the unending circle of life and death on the black powder battlefield.
Yet, despite the terrifying God of War label we started with, and despite the incredible, devastating power of the Grand Battery, the sources make a very specific concluding point that I want to highlight. They state that artillery, no matter how massed, could not actually win the battle alone.
No, it could not. It was the vital third arm, certainly, but the infantry resolutely remained the undisputed queen of the battlefield.
Why that specific distinction after everything we just discussed about how lethal the cannons were?
Because of the simple reality of geography. Artillery cannot physically hold ground. You can aggressively blast an enemy-held hill into dust. You can use shrapnel to drive every single living soul completely off the crest of that hill. But a bronze cannon cannot climb the hill and proudly plant a flag to claim it.
A cannon cannot clear an occupied village street by street or search buildings room by room.
Exactly. It cannot take prisoners, and it cannot police a captured territory.
The French General Alex actually wrote in the 1820s that, quote, "The infantry is the real force of the army."
And he was right. Artillery violently creates the necessary opportunity. It blasts the heavy locked door completely off its hinges. But the infantry still has to bravely walk through that smoke-filled doorway and physically occupy the space to actually claim the victory.
But the major shift in this specific era, the very reason we definitively call it the Age of Artillery battle, is that the massive guns were finally mobile enough and doctrinally powerful enough to actually manufacture those breakthrough opportunities on command.
That is the essential key. Before this era, generals mostly just waited patiently for a tactical opportunity to naturally present itself in the enemy line. Napoleon fundamentally used his massed artillery to violently force an opportunity into existence whenever and wherever he needed it.
Looking back at all this, it really feels like we are witnessing the dark birth of truly modern industrial warfare here.
We absolutely are.
When you deeply consider the rigid standardization of the Gribeauval system for the guns, the literal mass factory production of millions of iron shot, the brutal concept of the Grand Battery acting almost like a single unfeeling machine, this simply isn't a romantic duel between individual warriors on a field anymore.
It entirely removes the agency of the individual soldier. Think deeply about the brave infantryman standing trapped in that square formation. He is incredibly courageous. He is highly disciplined. He's doing everything his officers trained him to do perfectly. And then a pure mathematical calculation made of cast iron wipes him entirely out of existence from over a kilometer away.
He never even sees the face of the man who actually kills him.
It is deeply impersonal. It is cold and mechanized. The profound psychological terror of the timed exploding shell, the deadly airbursts of the shrapnel, these are the very direct, undeniable ancestors of the massive city-destroying artillery barrages of the First World War.
Napoleon's massed Grand Battery is effectively the grandfather of the horrific creeping barrage at the Somme.
It really is. This era marks the exact tipping point in history, where raw industrial technology definitively begins to overshadow individual human heroism as the ultimate deciding factor in war.
That is a very sobering thought to end our deep dive on. We have traveled all the way from the deep mud of the unpaved road, meticulously counting the daily fodder for 185 exhausted horses, through the grim physics of the Ricochet shot, and finally arrived at the very dawn of modern industrial slaughter.
It is incredibly heady history to process. But understanding the third arm is essential because it truly changed the world.
Well, that officially wraps up our trilogy examining Napoleonic tactics. We have thoroughly covered the stoic infantry, the charging cavalry, and now the devastating artillery. We genuinely hope this three-part series has given you a much clearer, richer picture of not just the basic who and when of military history, but the actual mechanical how.
And as always, the why.
Always the why. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.